If you are here for the smorgasbord of Angular fun, you're in the right room. Everyone in the right room? Woo! If not, it'd be really embarrassing to leave, so I apologize about that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephen Fluin. I lead developer relations on the Angular team at Google. So really my role at Google has two parts. First is helping developers be successful with Angular, and second, understanding what it's like being a developer in the real world, understanding the challenges that we face kind of every day, dealing with the kind of onslaught of technologies that are around us. And so on a day-to-day basis, I end up doing a lot of different things. I work with our GDE program, so we have a set of certified experts in Angular. I think there's something like 75 of them across the globe right now. I work with a lot of our partners, so companies that are using Angular at scale for billions of users or hundreds of team members. I work with people that are depending on us, so people downstream. I work with upstream dependencies. So trying to just make sure that developers are being successful as possible, and that we try and maintain a kind of a healthy ecosystem. One of the things I'm doing a little bit in a couple months is going to the Framework Summit in Utah, where we're trying to bring together all of the different frameworks and have more conversations, because in general, more conversations are definitely better. So to kick off our smorgasbord of fun, I thought it would be, I'm going to reverse the order from the title a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about Angular as in its current state and some of the most recent things that we've done, just catch us up and make sure we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to go deep into something called Angular Elements, and then I'm going to go into something called Schematics. And so there's going to be a little bit of talking at the beginning, and then I'm going to go into live coding, which I'm sure is going to go terribly wrong, and you can all laugh, and it's going to be fun. So let's get started. So for those of you that haven't used Angular yet, I always start a lot of these presentations with some of the Angular team's values, because I find that understanding the team's values is really critical in terms of understanding the way that we're building Angular, and you'll see this kind of manifest in a lot of the things we do. And so we tend to talk about three values. The first is apps that users love to use, because at the end of the day, the only reason to write software is for users. I know that a lot of us have a lot of fun building software, but in general, we get paid to do this. We get validation of building software by having someone actually use our applications. And so at the Angular team, we're definitely focused not only on the building of the applications, but what is the experience for those that are consuming that application. But second is apps that developers love to build. And so we really focus on developer experience in a number of different ways. And I'll come back to this kind of several points throughout the talk here. The last piece is a community where everyone feels welcome. And so if you look back to the AngularJS days and you look to all of our success that we've had today, it's only because we have this amazing community of people that are working with us, that are building on top of us, giving us feedback. The fact that there's companies that you can pay to get consulting or training. There's like hundreds of Udemy courses and Udacity courses all about Angular. There's books being written about Angular. We could not be successful without those folks. And so building an open source community, building something that has a surface that you can contribute to, you can build on, you can be successful with, is very important to us. One of the most rewarding parts of my job is talking to people who make their living building on top of Angular. And there's a whole bunch of them kind of across the globe. And so we talk about Angular as being a platform that makes it easy to build applications with the web. And so if you're familiar with AngularJS, AngularJS was more of a framework, right? It was a set of tools that help you render to the screen and control data binding and evaluate data and whatnot. But we're really trying to expand our mandate as part of Angular to being more of a platform. And when I say platform, I really mean focusing on the entire end-to-end developer experience. From how do you learn Angular, how do you get started with a new project in a way that's going to scale effectively, all the way to how do I deploy and configure my servers for my application. Because at the end of the day, a lot of us really want to be effective with new technologies, really cool learning about them, but you want to get back to your job, right? You want to get back to serving your users and solving and scratching your itches. And so we're trying to abstract all of the best practices out there and then bake them into Angular. And so the other part that I always try and highlight on here is the idea that you're building with the web. And so we are all kind of web developers, or most of us are probably web developers. Skill sets, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all these things. But your only target doesn't have to be for the web anymore, right? There's mobile devices, there's desktop applications, there's a lot more context that we deliver these web-built experiences, and Angular is really focused on taking your code further. I really think it's important to reflect on the size of our community and just kind of understand some of the momentum. So from our conversations with folks out in the world, around 90% of Angular applications are behind the firewall. If you look at, for example, Google, this is certainly true. I think it might even be more than 90%. We have over 900 applications at Google that are built in Angular at this point, and that number just keeps kind of growing. So we don't know when someone builds an Angular application behind the firewall how many people are using it, right? Some people talk about NPM downloads, but they're not trustworthy because if you have a CDN, if you have Artifactory, if you use Yarn, none of those things are being accounted for in your statistics. And so the best stand-in we have for understanding the growth of the Angular community is 30-day docs traffic. So how many people are coming to our site, looking up our API reference, and trying to learn about Angular? And so because this is really tied to the learning journey, I tend to think of it as a lower bound. So at the end of last year, we hit 1 million 30-day actives. So we were very excited about that. And then this year, we hit 1.4 million. And so we're experiencing kind of very dramatic, very happy growth. We are kind of elated at everything we're seeing in terms of the community. We're seeing new applications launch all the time. I noticed when I was booking my flight for this conference, Delta.com just shipped Angular on their homepage. So there's lots and lots and lots of them out there. Going back to that idea of community, we also have a ton of meetups. So generally, whenever I'm traveling, I just Google Angular city name here. And then there's typically a meetup group. So if you've never been to an Angular meetup, I definitely recommend it because there's lots of people that are there to support you, that want to kind of collaborate with you on a journey that we're all taking together to make better applications. One of the things to know about Angular is that we're really focused on having an integrated set of tools. And so we have a solution for a lot of the things out of the box. So we have a CLI that creates new projects. We have a router. We have a way to fetch data from the internet. We have a forms library, all these kind of great tools. And we're opinionated about them because we say, hey, all of these things are integrated, all of these things are tested, they work well together. But at the same time, we don't force you to use any of these things. If you wanted to go and write an Angular application using System.js, go have fun. Please don't do that. System.js is a mess. And we don't want you to have to learn those things. And so one of the things that we've heard is that when, for example, if you're on a team of Angular developers and you have to hire someone new, when that new person joins your team, they kind of automatically know the same things you know, and so they can be effective sooner by having a lot of these very common best practices. So we were trying to give you this opinionated, integrated stack without taking away your freedoms. We also really focus on this idea of collaboration. So I like to say that an Angular application looks day one like an AngularJS application looked after 3 or 4 months, right? Because back in the AngularJS days, you would start with a script tag at the top, and then you'd start building out features and features and features, and then you say, oh, well, now I want to minify my app. Now I want lazy loading. Now I want all these kind of cool features, and you'd end up having to squish all those things in. I remember configuring like grunt tasks and then gulp tasks to try and concatenate and minify and uglify all my code. But we've really focused on this idea of building Angular applications that scale very, very smoothly, and so we've baked in all those best practices from day one. We also focus on this idea of scaling kind of within a team, right? So even if you have hundreds of developers, you're all going to know the same standards, but there's also lots of different roles. And so, for example, we see a lot of different companies. You've got architects focused more on the module level, right? What are the sets of code that we want to load at any point in the experience? You've got developers that are more focused on a screen or a single kind of experience. And then you've got things like designers who can come in and maybe tweak the HTML a little bit. And Angular is really designed and architected so that all these people can collaborate in the same code base very effectively. So I mentioned a little bit about helping your code reach further, and this is something that we believe in a lot. And so we have built-in tools for example, shipping a PWA. So the browser now has superpowers, right? We can access offline cache. We can build web apps that work offline. We can send push notifications. We can do all these great things. And so Angular is baking a lot of those capabilities into the platform. But then we're also working with teams like NativeScript. So we're working on an announcement right now where, for example, as of 6.1 in the CLI, you can actually have a hybrid application that's built in Angular, and you have your HTML and you have your NativeScript side by side. And you can build either of these things. So you can get native UI widget rendering on iOS and Android, or you can get web rendering. And then we're also focused on things like Electron. And one of the things I'm going to come back to a few times, and we're actually going to do a demo of this, is demonstrating something called Angular Elements, which is the idea that while Angular is really good at the orchestration of an application, right? So making sure all the pieces work together, making sure that you're getting data at the right points in your application at the right time, there's places where you want to share some of your functionality and you want to make it accessible to other people. And so the Angular Elements project is really focused on that challenge. So we just released 6.1 of the core kind of framework part of Angular and our CLI. And the 6.0 kind of major release is really focused on this idea of balancing stability and innovation. So I think about stability from the perspective of you want to learn Angular and then keep writing Angular applications without having to learn something new every couple of months. But at the same time, you want all of the innovation, right? The browsers are changing, the web is changing, and you want to be able to take advantage of those things as easily as possible. And I'll give a couple of examples of that. So one example of an innovation is ES 2015 or ES Next, ES 2017, right? There's all these new great language features built into JavaScript that are starting to slowly get shipped in the browsers. Now, because of the Angular's control of the compilation and runtime, we could, for example, flip a switch within the CLI that automatically builds ES 2015 and ES5 and then differential serves whichever one the user should be using. Now, we don't yet recommend this. There are still devices out there like the Google search crawler that aren't capable of running ES 2015, right? It doesn't support that. It needs ES5. And so we haven't flipped that switch yet, but this is something that we're spending a lot of time on, right? We're in TC39, we're in WhatWG, because we care about the future of the web and we care about standards. And so we're going to be taking all the standards that are out there and, as it makes sense, bringing them into Angular. Another great example of this is that we just brought Shadow DOM v1 into Angular so that developers that care about Shadow DOM and want to use that now get the kind of new, more modern, agreed upon spec. So as part of the 6.0 release, one of the big things we did is we tried to rethink the updating process. So we're all web developers here. What do you do when one of your dependencies updates, right? You say, update that dependency, and then you look for bugs, right? You see, where did my application break? And then I go read a guide, I go read GitHub, I Google the problems, and then there's like a migration guide that says, oh, go change it in these 8 places. And you have to go and do all of that work. And so we created this tool, ng-update, that tries to invert that a little bit. So when you run ng-update at Angular core, we're going to go ahead and do the normal thing that you'd expect from an npm or a yarn install, where we're going to install the latest version. But we're also going to do a bunch of other things on top of that. So we've invented this thing called a package group, where if there's a set of dependencies that should be kept in sync, we can make sure that when you update one, we automatically update all of them. So when you run ng-update Angular core, we're going to update all of the different Angular packages. We're also going to take a look at peer dependencies. So in the NPM world, dependencies are actually a really big problem. If you use dependencies as normal, everything will get nested within your application if there's 2 versions. And so one part of your application is going to be using one version and another part of your application is using a different version from NPM. And this is really bad because then you get 2 copies of the code base, you get different functionality based on where you are in the code base. And so the Angular team, for example, we use peer dependencies almost exclusively. So RxJS, Zone.js, TypeScript, all these things are peer dependencies. And by doing that, we can make sure that your dependencies are flattened, so that if 2 packages have the same peer dependencies, you're just going to rely on the same version. But peer dependencies are harder because the NPM tooling doesn't yet support keeping these things up to date because it doesn't know about the dependency tree as intelligently yet. And so ng-update will automatically take a look at that dependency tree and try and update all of your peer dependencies. So RxJS, Zone.js, TypeScript, all the different dependencies you're using. Now, in addition to doing all of that with the package manager, it's also going to run something called a schematic under the hood. So it's going to look at every single package that it touches and run an update schematic. So I'm going to go a lot into schematics today, so this is pretty important. Schematics are really just an open platform for modifying projects. So we have a CLI that's able to scaffold out new projects, and that's basically a transform that takes an empty tree of files and returns a full tree of files. When you add a component using our CLI, it takes your project and returns your project plus another component, and so on and so on. But what we can do now is, with this ng-update command, is dependencies can write schematics that tell you how to update your application. And one of the dependencies that we did this with was RxJS. So a lot of people really like reactive programming once they kind of figure it out, once they grok it. And so as part of RxJS 6, a bunch of the APIs were changed, right? The code paths were changed, APIs were removed, deprecated, etc. And so what we did was, if you use ng-update on Angular in your application, we're automatically going to add the compatibility package to RxJS so that all your code keeps working. We did this with Material as well. So if you ng updated a project that had Material, we would automatically rename the APIs that were renamed under the hood, right? You could have gone and done this manually. There was a migration guide, but the idea that your dependencies should be responsible for updating your code is really what we care about. And I say open platform here because anyone can write schematics and include them in your application. So if you are building a component library, you're building a set of tools, anything you ship to NPM or any code that's going to be shared and consumed by another team, think about how when you need to make changes to your code, how can you use your understanding of how you should be used and automatically update their code. And we feel like this is a really important shift that is happening. And a very similar related shift is with adding new capabilities to a project. And so as part of 6.0, we announced ng add, which again does an npm or yarn install under the hood using kind of the dependency system, using whatever you've got set up on your computer. But then it basically automates away the first page of that getting started guide, right? If you've ever looked up like a project or a plugin and you install the plugin and then there's like a one-page guide like, oh, add this line to your top file and then include these 2 extra dependencies. So the idea with schematics being applied to ng add is that we can do all those things for you. So when you ng add at Angular/PWA, we set up the configuration for you. We add the polyfills that you need, all those sorts of things. When you do it with Angular Elements, again, we add the polyfill, we set up your module, and so on. And so this is actually a really big deal that we feel that a lot of people are adopting. So one of the things we track is some of the top used component libraries out there. And basically 5 out of the 5 top component libraries for Angular have now adopted ng add schematics. So that's Kendo, that's ng Bootstrap, that's Clarity, all these teams because they want it to be easy to add their capabilities to a project. So if you're trying to create an ng update schematic, it's pretty simple. You put one in your, you put this ng update key in your package.json and you refer to your collection. And then in the collection, you just give it a migration name. And then we look at that version property and say, okay, is the user going to that version or crossing over that version, right? Because maybe the user hasn't updated in 2 years. And their update is going to have 30 different changes you need to make to their code base. So we're going to batch all those up and run all of them in sequence. Also, creating an ng add schematic is pretty simple. You just create a schematic named ng add, and then you give it a name, you give it an alias, and then you put that in your package, and when someone ng adds it, it'll npm install it, and it will run your schematic. So I'll just touch on a couple more things that are really exciting in the ecosystem. So first is a tool coming out of a company called Narwhal called Angular Console. So how many people here like the command line, like the terminal? Okay, it was most people here. What we found is that there's a lot of web developers that really like the terminal, but there's also a lot of web developers that don't like the terminal. If you're coming from a .NET world, the terminal can be frustrating. It's not discoverable. It has kind of certain UI challenges to a CLI. We've also found that people that are new to software development really struggle with terminals. And so what Angular Console does is it's a GUI on top of our CLI. And so you can download the Angular Console. You don't have to install NPM. You don't have to install Node. You don't have to install the Angular CLI. And then it gives you a visual presentation that lets you do things like create new projects, install dependencies, all these things. And so we actually had a project that was working on building this, and then we found out and talked to the Narwhal folks that they were building it, and we said, hey, let's open source and just work together. So they've announced this on, I think it's angularconsole.com, and we're working to bring this into the kind of core user journey for all Angular developers. Another thing we just announced is a new set of AngularJS migration tools. So a lot of people have a lot of AngularJS code lying around. And while there's been a bunch of recommendations on how to get from AngularJS to Angular, there were a lot of best practices that have been figured out as people do these scaled migrations over the last couple of years. And so we basically spent the summer and we took another look at this migration path. And we built out 2 new tools. The first is the ng Migration Assistant. Basically it does a relatively straightforward analysis of your AngularJS app and makes a recommendation of a path. So depending on what sort of AngularJS patterns you're using, depending on the complexity of your code base, it says, hey, this type of incremental migration will work for you, or hey, you've got 2 lines of AngularJS, you should just rewrite it. The other tool that we announced was called the ng Migration Forum, which is a community hub where we've worked with a bunch of the leaders, the thought leaders in the migration space, and brought a lot of their best practices into one place. And so this is a community wiki, just living on GitHub, and our idea is that anyone should be able to kind of go in and contribute their ideas, their recommendations to this migration path to make it easier for everyone. All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit of live coding, and the first thing we're going to be doing is building an Angular element. So I talked about Angular being really good at the orchestration of an application, but web standards have evolved, and now there's a new building block that's native to the browser called a custom element that can be tapped into to handle some of the bootstrapping. Custom elements are really, really good for independent, reusable UIs. And I say that very explicitly because one of the challenges is people start thinking that you can use custom elements for everything, and there's problems with that. And the example that I like to give is, imagine a form field that you've created. So you've got a nice My Company input box that you've built as a custom element. If you now have a standard web form that you want to take the value of that field, you have to write all of the JavaScript to wire up that custom element. You have to, when the user hits the submit button, you have to go and look at all the values of all the custom elements, pull those values out, assemble them with the values in the form object, and then you can submit the data. So that's a problem with custom elements that Angular doesn't have, because Angular has a forms library that automatically wires up all these things for you. Right? We know how to access the value of your components, and we know how to aggregate all that into a form. So when you click submit and you ask for the form's value, you get all of the appropriate fields. But for reusable cases, maybe you're building just a isolated date picker, or maybe you're building a weather widget, something like that, where you don't have to be as orchestrated about how it's being used. Custom elements are a really, really good choice for making code that can be used by anyone, that doesn't matter what framework or technology set you're using. So I'm going to dive into a demo here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a blank Angular application that I've built, and we're going to take a component, we're going to turn it into a custom element, and then I'll talk about some other strategies. So the magic secret that I did before we got here, if I can go to the right folder, is I have created a new CLI application with Angular. So if you run the ng new command in our CLI, this is what you'll get. Hopefully everyone can see this. You get out a full configuration, so git ignore, editor configuration, tests. But then if you look in the source/app folder, this is really the heart of my app. So I've got a set of HTML, welcome to title. You've got a set of TypeScript that gives you status and connects it to the CSS. And so if we run ng serve, this should come up. This is where the demo starts going wrong, by the way. All right, hooray, step one worked. So now we have welcome to my app. So this is just the hello world that you get scaffolded out by the CLI. You can see it matches up to that HTML, but then we're doing some data binding here. So the other thing that I did, so I didn't have to rely too much on internet, was I ran ng-add at angular/elements. And so what this did under the hood was it added the polyfill to my application, and it installed that npm package so that I could get at custom elements. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my app module, and we already have a component, right? We have that root component that's part of our application. And I'm going to take that component and I'm going to wrap it as a custom element that's reusable in the browser. So normally what happens is you have this app root that when Angular bootstraps, you're telling it explicitly, go find and bootstrap the app root. But we don't want to do that anymore. We want to wrap this as a custom element. So I'm going to import create custom element from at angular/elements. Get rid of that. And anyone that points out a bug as I'm typing gets a pair of Angular sunglasses, or at least the first couple people. All right, so we now have this method that does the wrapping for us. And now I need a copy of the injector. So one of the things with elements is that you still need access to all of the other pieces of Angular so that the orchestration can happen. So what I can do is I can use the dependency injection system to say, give me an injector of type injector. And if I import the right one, that should work. And then we're going to make it private so that it's available anywhere in our module here. And then I'm going to say ng do bootstrap. And so on bootstrapping of Angular, what we're going to do is we're going to create a custom element. So we're going to say let lm equal create custom element. And we're going to pass it two things. We're going to pass it that app component, and we're going to pass it the injector. All right, it's never used, so now let's go ahead and use it. So now there's this browser object called custom elements, and it's got a define method, and then I'm just going to pass it a selector. So I'm just going to call it my element. Remind me about that in a second, otherwise I'll forget. So instead of bootstrapping based on this app component, we're creating a new custom element. So this is a browser native component called my element. So in order for us to actually render this, what we're going to do is I'm going to get rid of this from the bootstrap because we don't want Angular bootstrapping our components. I need to add this to the list of things to compile. So I'm going to compile my app component, and then I'm going to turn off schema validation. So I'm going to say custom element schema. This just says, hey, if you encounter an HTML element that you don't recognize, it's okay. It's coming from custom elements. All right, it wants me to use const. Let's write code the best way possible. Thanks, TypeScript. All right, and now if I haven't forgotten anything, we should now have a app component that's being compiled. It's not being bootstrapped anymore, and it should be available as part of our application. So let's go ahead and kill this and run an ng-serve. So what will this do? This should render nothing because we are not using our custom element anywhere, right? So we have that app root in our index.html, but we do not have my element. So if we now jump over to our index.html and swap out our app root for a my element tag, that should be the trigger that actually now asks the browser, hey, go get this as a custom element, and then render it to the screen. All right. Please use the new operator. So there's a bug in document register element. This is the fun of having web development in general. So I need to just pin that to 181. So this is a polyfill bug that they just introduced. Oh, that's going to take forever. All right, so I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. I tried to do all the network things prior to this, but looks like I was not successful. All right, so when we come back, stay tuned, because when we refresh, the element should just be rendering magically. All right, for the second part of the demo here, what I'm going to do is I actually want to dig into schematics. And so there's a bunch of different tools out there for building and running schematics. And I want to show you both how to do something like render a file, but then also I want to fulfill the promise that I talked about last year at Decoupled Dev Days of querying a backend API and creating components based on that. So we're going to give this a try. So what I'm going to do is I'll just first show you the couple of commands that I'm going to be using. So before I got here, because I didn't want to wait for npm installs and network, I installed Angular Dev Kit /schematics CLI, and this gave me a schematics CLI. So I've got just now the schematics command line tool. And I ran schematics blank, my schematic, which is a schematics command that uses schematics to create a schematic. Who didn't follow that? All right, everyone got it, perfect. So basically this is the way that you template out a new schematic, right? So schematics are the things that can transform my project to add something to my app, to change it, whatever we want. And so if we open VS Code in this project, we should see, here, let's try that one more time. If you open VS Code, we should see a blank schematic. So if we look in source, my schematic, this is what a blank schematic looks like. So it's a very simple function called my schematic, because that's the name I gave it. And it returns a function that takes a tree in and returns a tree. So remember I talked about how it's a tree transform, like a new app takes in an empty tree and returns something. So what we can do is we can create something very simple. Like for example, let's take our tree and let's create a new file. We'll just call it file.txt, and we'll put contents in there called my hi Drupal community with a little bit of a smiley face. All right, so now that I have built a schematic, we have to, or now that I've written a schematic, we just need to build it and run it. So I'm gonna run yarn build. And if this errors out, I'm gonna tell TypeScript to calm down. All right, calm down, TypeScript. All right, if this still errors, I'm gonna go in and tell TypeScript really calm down. No, that worked. All right, so we've got it built now, and now I can run the schematics command. I'll point it at the current folder, and I'll run the my schematic. And we see what I did wrong. I wonder if this is blocking based on the npm install. That would be very problematic. No, there. So this created file.txt. So it did exactly what we told it to do. But by default, Schematics is actually in dry run mode. So it's just showing you what it does. So if I wanted to say dry run equals false, now it'll actually create that file. So if I look here, I should see file.txt, file.txt. Hi, Drupal community. So we have a working schematic. It was able to take in a tree, so our existing file system, and added a file to it, and then render that to disk. So now we're going to do something a little bit more complex. And so I didn't want you to have to sit and watch me type, so I'm going to copy and paste here. But I'll walk you through everything this is doing. So just like before, we have a schematic that's taking in a tree and returning another tree. But this time we're actually going to be doing something asynchronous. So I also sneakily npm installed something called node fetch. So it just gives you fetch in the browser. And so what I can do now is I can fetch, for example, this API. So what this is this is a list of repositories on GitHub with the name Angular. Very nice, looks like JSON. We've all worked with JSON before. So this could be any API that you might be querying. And then it's got some structure, it's got this items property, etc. And so what we're gonna do is we take that result, we turn it into JSON, just because that's how the fetch API works. And then what we do is we're going to take all of that content of the items property, and we're going to stringify that, and we're going to write that to disk. So let's go ahead and try that first. All right, so I'm going to yarn build and schematics.myschematic. Just going to do a quick build. All right, TypeScript, you need to calm down. Let's just get rid of all these. All right, let's see if that's any happier. Done. That's a much better sign. All right, so now we've created test.json, and again, we have to do dry run equals false. This is just a protection for you as a developer, because one of the things that we saw when we first released schematics was developers would build these really awesome schematics that like replace the file system with what they wanted to be replaced with, and they ran it in this folder that they were developing the schematic in and erased their whole project. So that's why we default to dry run. All right, we cat test.json. So again, we're creating a file, but we're doing it asynchronously now. Now we're creating that file based on something that's happening before. And so we're going to take this one step further, and we're going to do it in a little bit more sophisticated manner. So I'm going to comment this back in. And so what we're doing here is we're running a chain of schematics. So that's basically running multiple schematics in a sequence. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to read that file out, and we're going to run an external schematic. So this time we're actually going to be using the Angular schematics to generate components based on the content of that JSON file. So you can see here how if you had a Contenta installation, for example, with a API that's returning here's all my data types, you could build schematics that go and fetch those data types and build components, build services out of those things automatically. All right, so we've got, so again, this is just taking that array from the JSON of items, And then it's for each item in that array. So for each repository, we're running this external schematic. And in this case, we're running the component schematic. And then we're taking the name of that repository and using that as the name of the component. And we'll put it in the project my app. So I'm going to yarn build this. And now because this is running an Angular schematic, it actually has to be done from an Angular project. So we should be able to do this from the my app project. All right, let's try schematics, / my schematic, source collection, my schematic. So this, if I've done everything right, it's went and fetched the API from the JSON, or it fetched the JSON from the API, excuse me, figured out all those different repos that are coming back from the server, and then did a recursive process of saying, hey, go create an Angular component following all of the best practices that are standard in my project for each of those. So that's pretty cool, right? Now, theoretically, this is what I wanted. If I wanted to build a custom component for every repository on GitHub, I've just done that. But there's kind of lots more things, and hopefully your imagination can kind of show you some of the cool things you could do with that. All right, let's go back and check on our Angular Elements example. All right, looks like it worked. All right, if the error goes away, we all have to clap. If not, you can boo. But then no sunglasses, so. Ta-da! All right, so again, what's happening here is instead of using Angular to bootstrap, I'm using the browser to bootstrap an Angular component. That this Angular component is being shipped as a custom element that I could take this main.js file, give that to a friend, put that in their application, and use that today. So this is really cool. This works today. A lot of people are doing this today, but we're trying to make it a lot better before we push the world into creating Angular elements. So I want to talk a little bit about the future. So in general, when you look at the future of Angular, one of the major missions that we've got is bringing the best of Google into the world of software development. Because Google does a lot of really cool things. So for example, we have a giant mono repository of all of our source code. So for example, everything from self-driving cars to Gmail to Google Play Music, Google Cloud Platform, all these are in a single code base. We have a really intelligent build system called Bazel that will rebuild as necessary everything in the dependency chain. So if you build a new Angular app at Google, as needed, we will recompile your application, we'll recompile Angular, we'll recompile Node, we'll recompile the Linux kernel, we'll recompile GCC, because all of that code is in one single code base. We have no kind of external dependencies. And so we had to get really good at doing this at scale across a giant code base. And the way that we do that is with this tool Bazel. So we have an early access program right now where we have a bunch of companies that are moving their toolchain over to Bazel, because the big benefit there is incrementality. If you have a large application with hundreds of modules and thousands of pages, you don't want to rebuild the entire application every time you make one little change. You want the rebuild time to be tied to the size of the change, not the size of the application. And that's something Webpack's not yet capable of. Webpack has to know about the entire universe to do any sort of compilation. And so doing things incrementally is very, very challenging. At Google Cloud Next, we also announced a couple new things that the Angular team's tapping into. So first is RBE, a remote build execution. So if you did have a build that was using Bazel, you could just farm that out to a server farm, right? So instead of using your local CPU resources to compile a big complex monorepo, you can do that in a distributed way and parallelize it. We also have a very nice source search that we just released that you can actually do like code searches that we use within Google, but you can search any of your code and actually see dependencies, see references right in the browser, which is very cool. And then finally, just thinking about testability and scalability. So Angular includes a lot of tests. We include a lot of focus on making sure that anything you do on day one in your Angular application is going to continue to scale to day 100, day 1,000, etc. And so like, where we're trying to bring all of the philosophies that Google has, such as monorepositories, to the world. And I'll give you one final example of how this is beneficial. So in 2014, I think it was, there was the Heartbleed SSL bug, right? Every web server across the internet was suddenly vulnerable to this man-in-the-middle attack by a Heartbleed. But because Google has a single code base, and we only had one version of SSL, we patched that OpenSSL version in one place, and then we basically redeployed all of our apps. So all of Google was virtually fixed in about a week. So if you think about your companies, imagine patching all of the different versions of all the projects out there. Right? This is very challenging, but we want to make it easy to do things like that. So the last piece that I'll talk a little bit about is Project Ivy. So under the hood of Angular, we're doing a bunch of work right now to kind of reinvent our rendering pipeline. And so how the Angular renderer works a little bit today is you basically have a renderer that's a little bit like an interpreter. It pulls in your code and says, does this code have pipes? Run the pipes. Does this code have dependency injection? Run the dependency injection. And so what ends up happening is, even if you're just building a Hello World application or a simple date picker, you're pulling in all of Angular. So this is not really the best because your Hello World bundle size is about 150 KB, which in our opinion, from a user perspective, is too big. It's probably fine on most desktop experiences, but when we think about mobile, when we think about emerging markets, that's too big. And so we're rewriting the Angular runtime and rendering engine so that instead of Angular's renderer pulling in your code's going to be what's pulling in all of the Angular features. And so, for example, if you don't use a pipe in your application, we're never going to render the instruction that calls the pipes, and so that would be dead code, and we can just eliminate it out. So verify this in the Angular repository right now, but our Hello World is about 3 KB because it doesn't use any features. And we think we might be able to even get it smaller. But the idea is, if you don't use the features, you don't have to pay for them. And this becomes really important for very large web applications as well, because if you have a large app, you're probably using a lot of the different features in different places. And so by combining lazy loading with this idea of being able to tree shake away features you're not using, you don't have to pay for any of the things you're using in that first load, right? You can delay them. You can say, only when my user navigates to an admin panel or the rich charting dashboard panel do I have to pull in all those extra features. And so trying to ship the minimum amount of code to the user to maximize the amount of code that they're running that we send them. So Ivy is not yet ready. It's not going to be ready for 7. Right now we're working on the compiler and the runtime. But the good news is that all the work we're doing under the hood is going to be completely backward compatible. So basically, when it's done, when it's ready, when we validate it across a bunch of big apps, we've validated across all of Google, we'll just flip a switch, and then everyone will automatically be using the Ivy runtime. So we're very excited about that day because all the bundles are going to get smaller, and it's going to be a great day for users. So in general, Angular is really trying to have this mentality of allowing you to keep writing the same apps that you write today, tomorrow, right? Learn the skill set once, learn kind of the new technologies as they come along, but not have to rethink everything. But at the same time, take advantage of the new features of the web, WebAssembly, ES 2015, ES Next, all these great things, service workers. Kind of the future of the web is going to continue coming, and it's going to continue evolving, and we're going to take your code there with us. Thank you so much. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions, if there are any. Then I said, no one pointed out any bugs. What about all the bugs? I typed like ng do booty, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Can you give some simple examples of your Angular components, how they're being used, or who's using them, and how, or how they'll get deployed?
Sure. So right now, because we have not yet shipped Ivy, so they're bigger in general. So what we say today is the best practice is to use them in the context of an Angular app. So on Angular I/O, we are using them today, and I'll kind of explain why. So one of the really nice things about Angular is that it has a complete separation between the idea of content and the idea of code. And from a security model standpoint, content never executes. Like ever, they're completely separate. In AngularJS, you could smash it, and if you could server-side render, you could end up running code that you weren't intending to, and it was a big problem in AngularJS. But we keep them completely separate now. But that means that if you have content like, hey, here's a guide on how to use Angular, here's a code sample, we can't put behaviors into that content. And so what we were doing is we wrote a bunch of custom code to manually look at the content that was loaded and then enrich it with behaviors. But with custom elements now, with Angular elements, we don't have to do that. So what we did is we took all of our components for like, here's an interactive code colored with a copy button in the corner of code sample. We took that component and we rendered it as a custom element so that instead of Angular bootstrapping and running functionality, it's the browser that's bootstrapping that within the content. We have a lot of companies out there that are trying to do this, even though the bundle size is huge. So, for example, I've been working with Weather Underground to try and help them get weather widgets all over the place. And there's actually so many people that want to do this today. So we refuse to put it into our CLI, our core experience of rendering out standalone custom elements. The community actually went and built a tool to do this. So there's a tool out there called NGX Build Plus. NGX Build Plus was from one of our GDEs who said, hey, I want to render Angular elements today and share them with my friends. And so what NGX Build Plus does is it allows you to separate the build of Angular and the build of your custom element. So the idea is you put an Angular.js at the top of your page, and then you can put as many custom element.js files as you want, and they'll all use that same centralized Angular. So you can think of it as dynamically linking. And then, I mean, in our long term, we want to bake it directly into the CLI and support both dynamically linking, where you can share an instance of Angular across a bunch of components, or make it statically linked, saying, hey, I don't want them to have to install anything, just one JavaScript bundle, here it is. Yeah.
So based on some of the changes with Angular 6, the updates, would you say that it's pretty much at parity with React, with regards to React Native, with isomorphic and all that stuff? Is there kind of
so feature parity, like it's
so like the big like the big kind of
so like
reasons to go to React. Is there basically is there the same reason to use Angular?
So React is a library.
Yeah.
So you would never build an application with just React, right? You'd build a React app, plus you'd find a router, plus you'd find a forms library, plus you'd find a state management. So it's really not like comparing likes to likes. So like Angular, we have all that baked in. And millions of people are choosing Angular. I mean, there was a bit of fear. So if you go back to 2016, when we released 2.0.0, we'd made this big transition from AngularJS to Angular, and everyone's like, oh, I don't know if I can choose Angular yet. As of 2017, that's gone. Angular is being successful. It's being used by giant companies, small companies, startups. We track hundreds of thousands of public Angular sites on the web, millions of developers. So cool. I think Angular is a great choice. I mean, React is also a great choice, but for different things.
Yeah. But like in terms of creating a native application.
Oh, so yeah, with our native script story?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, React Native has its own challenges. So does NativeScript. Anytime you have non-native code, there's certain challenges. So for example, in both cases, you're spinning up the V8 engine. Some of the benchmarks, so we've been pushing the NativeScript team to have more benchmarks. And for some reason now, NativeScript Android rendering is faster than native Android rendering. Because with native Android rendering, you actually have to spin up a bunch of Java classes and Java objects, which is a little bit slower than NativeScript.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
We use Angular with a Drupal project since 4 years.
Awesome.
And
see?
and one of the biggest challenges we have is path management. You know, when you use the router of Angular, you create define some route, but these are some technical routes, but not some contents route. And in Drupal, you can create some nodes and give the contributor the ability to create its own path for this content. And then when the path arrives in your application, there is no corresponding path between the Drupal path and the router path. So for lots of projects we had before, we used the project UI router because we weren't path dependent, we only manage some state. So we asked Drupal, what is this URL? It is a node of kind article. So I launched a template, a news template. And then now we try to use the official router, but to stop him at the moment when we can say, okay, Drupal send me an article, I want the router to go to this path, but this path as a technical path, not a content path.
Okay.
And I don't know, I don't see anything official to manage this kind of...
Sure. So we can chat about that later. I mean, there's a bunch of things you can do in terms of custom router configurations. So this is not directly addressing your question. We'll have to talk later, but it made me think of it. So one of the things we're doing is we're working a lot on server-side rendering of Angular.
Sorry?
server-side rendering of Angular.
Yeah.
So for example, we've built a router for Google Shopping Express. For example, they just launched in production a couple weeks ago, where it server-side renders the application as static HTML, and then loads in the application in the background. And then on the next user click, we either swap out the application, or we do another static load if the application hasn't been loaded. And so we're looking to add that router to the set of options.
Sorry, it was just on that answer.
Sure.
Did you say that it's rendering it server side, pushing the HTML, and then loading it? But so basically, if they click early, it'll do another server side
Yes.
render. But if
Yep.
they click late,
Yes.
and they've got the application,
Then it will swap out all of the static HTML context and then basically bootstrap Angular into the next state. Yeah, it's trying to get the best of both worlds. What's that?
How hard is that to implement?
Not super hard. I mean, we just have to release the router that does it for you.
Okay. Timeline?
Soon. No, because I mean, like, so this is a big problem. So how many people have ads on their sites? So with modern JavaScript, you get this weird, like, if you try server-side rendering and then you try running modern JavaScript, it swaps out the ad that you had before with a new ad, and then your advertisers are unhappy, right? You get these double impression bugs. And this completely eliminates that.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to go with this gentleman. I think he raised his hand first. Sorry.
Does NT update address module changes, like from HTTP client to HTTP, things like that?
So it doesn't handle HTTP client to HTTP, or HTTP to HTTP client, but in general, going forward, it should. So yeah, that transition happened back in 4.3. But we're always now, whenever we do any sort of change to Angular, we're looking for how do we tool this. Because we actually, how it works in Google is, when you make a change that breaks another person's tests, you have to fix it. So now we have 900 apps that if we make a breaking change, we have to go fix all their apps. And so the only way for us to do that is to build good tooling that does it. And so we've been open sourcing all that tooling. Awesome. I'll be around to chat more. I want to give the next presenter plenty of time. Thank you so much.